This Easter, the eggs you hunt may not hold sweet surprises, but dark secrets that come at a terrifying cost. In a small town where tradition reigns, children uncover hollow chocolate eggs that whisper forgotten truths, hidden bodies, overheard confessions, and long-buried sins. But with each bite, something inside them begins to slip away. As memories fade and their eyes grow hollow, the true price of knowledge becomes clear. The more they learn, the less they remember, and soon the whispers grow louder, demanding more than just secrets. They hunger for souls. Easter is supposed to be a time of renewal, of joy, and of light. Celebrations that bring people together with baskets of candy and the promise of new beginnings. But what if this year's Easter hides something darker, something you can't escape? In a quiet town, nestled beneath the shadows of towering trees, an ancient tradition takes a sinister turn. For generations, the children have participated in the Easter egg hunt, their baskets filling with brightly colored treasures hidden around the town. But this year, something changes. The eggs are no longer full of chocolate or toys. Instead, they hold something far more terrifying: secrets. When a group of children stumbles upon hollow chocolate eggs hidden in odd places, they believe they've found nothing more than a sweet surprise. But as they crack open the shells, they uncover dark truths, missing friends, overheard arguments, and even long-buried bodies. Each piece of knowledge weighs heavy on their hearts, and yet something starts to shift within them. As the days pass, the more they know, the more they forget. The secrets take a toll, erasing their memories, their identities, and their humanity. What began as an innocent Easter egg hunt has spiraled into a nightmare from which there's no waking up. The children grow distant, their eyes hollow, their voices thin as they begin to lose themselves to the dark magic hidden within the eggs. What would you be willing to sacrifice for knowledge? And when the hunt turns on you, will you be able to remember who you are before it's too late? Story number 1. Every year, on Easter morning, the old willow basket appeared on the steps of St. Mary's Church. It was woven of thin, pale branches, its shape imperfect but somehow enduring. The basket had been there as long as anyone could remember, and every Easter, without fail, there it was, silent, waiting. It was said that it had once been made by hand, many, many years ago, its weaver long dead, their name forgotten by time. But no one really cared about that anymore. It was a tradition. Every child in the village waited for the moment when the bells rang, signaling the start of the Easter service. And when the church doors finally opened, they rushed forward, eager to claim their prize. Inside the basket were the eggs. At first glance, they seemed to be ordinary Easter eggs, colored in pastel shades, decorated with tiny flowers and delicate patterns. But there was always something off about them, something that felt too old, too heavy for something so small. The eggs were warm to the touch, as if they had been left under the sun for hours, even though they hadn't. This year, the basket had appeared as always, nestled against the stone steps. Children crowded around it, their laughter filling the air, hands outstretched, waiting to claim their Easter treasures. Hannah was the first to reach it, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the eggs. She chose one, a soft, pink one, its surface decorated with faint golden lines that seemed to shimmer in the light. Her eyes sparkled as she held it up for the others to see, and the children cheered. When the last of the eggs had been chosen, the children ran off, eager to begin their day of festivities. But for some, the excitement didn't last long. Hannah, for one, didn't sleep well that night. Her dreams were strange, unsettling. She kept seeing faces, pale and twisted, pressed against the walls of her room. And underneath it all, the whispering. A soft, insistent murmur, like voices coming from far beneath the earth. Come back, come back. She awoke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing. The air in her room felt thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the egg still sitting on her nightstand. It was cold now, its warmth gone, but the golden line seemed to pulse in the dim light. Hannah stared at it, mesmerized until a sudden chill crept over her skin. The next morning, she awoke with mud on her sheets, thick, damp clumps of it, the smell of earth heavy in the air. At first, she thought she was still dreaming, but when she looked down at her hands, she saw something else. Roots. Tiny roots, thin as threads, tangled around her fingers, wriggling as though alive. She screamed and yanked her hand back, but the roots were stubborn. They clung to her skin, pulling at her with a strength she couldn't understand. When she looked closer, she saw the mud had seeped into her bed, staining the sheets, and underneath, something was shifting. Something dark and alive, moving beneath the surface, like the earth itself was breathing. The door to her room slammed open, and her mother rushed in, eyes wide in panic. Hannah, what happened? But her voice faltered when she saw the tangled roots creeping from the bed, the dirt spreading across the floor. It's the egg, Hannah whispered, her voice shaking. It came from the basket. Her mother's face paled. Don't be silly, dear, it's just a tradition. But Hannah knew. She knew that the basket wasn't just some harmless village custom. It had come from somewhere darker, somewhere deep in the earth, where the roots of something ancient had taken hold. The egg had been just the beginning. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time, no longer just a faint murmur, but a low, guttural sound echoing in the walls of her home. Hannah couldn't escape it, couldn't outrun it. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces again, pale and hollow-eyed, reaching for her, their mouths opening in silent screams. Come back, come back. The next morning, there were more. Children with mud in their beds, more with tangled roots creeping over their skin, and the whispers spread, infecting the village like a sickness, a curse that had been buried long ago, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The willow basket sat on the steps of St. Mary's Church, its branches creaking in the wind, as though it were waiting for something or someone. No one knew how to stop it, and no one dared ask what would happen when the last egg was taken. Story number 2. It was a quiet Easter morning when Emily received the package. The delivery was strange. No return address, no note. Just a small, plain box wrapped in brown paper, the edges frayed like it had been handled too many times. She wasn't expecting anything, which made the surprise all the more unsettling. She tore open the paper and found a single object inside, an egg. But it wasn't just any egg. The shell was painted in deep, dark blue, the kind of blue that looked almost bruised, like someone had tried to hide the ache of it beneath delicate strokes of faded gold. Emily ran her fingers over the cool surface, the design intricate, a pattern of swirls and dots as if it had been made with careful, obsessive hands. There was something odd about it, something wrong, but Emily, not wanting to dwell on the strangeness of it, placed the egg on her kitchen counter and turned away. The house was silent, the morning light spilling in through the windows, warming the wood floors. But as the day passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That night, Just as she was about to fall asleep, something compelled her to pick up the egg again. She didn't know why, only that it was as if it called to her. She stared at it for a long time before finally cracking it open, the shell splitting neatly in her hands. Inside, there was an eye. A single, human eye nestled in the center of the egg's hollow. It wasn't just any eye, it was wide open, staring directly at her with a kind of knowing, dark, empty, and yet alive. The eye blinked, slowly, deliberately. Emily's stomach turned and she dropped the egg, but the eye remained on her mind. She could still feel it staring, burning into her, even as the pieces of the shell scattered across the table. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind raced, her pulse quickened. She kept seeing the eye, not just in her dreams, but in flashes, in moments when she least expected it. And then, it started. Things began to change. At first, it was subtle, a shadow moving at the edge of her vision, a whisper, soft and untraceable, like someone breathing right behind her. But it grew worse. The next night, she saw them, pale figures, thin as smoke, drifting through the walls of her apartment. They weren't solid, they were something more like memories, things that had never fully left. Their faces were indistinct, like the ghostly shapes in old photographs, but their eyes, those eyes were always the same as the one in the egg. She would wake up to find herself staring into those empty, knowing eyes in the mirrors, in the reflections of windows. At times, they felt too close, too real, as if they were waiting for her to speak, to give them permission to do something, anything. And then came the reflections. They started to move on their own. One morning, Emily stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing her hair when her reflection did something it had never done before. It turned its head slightly, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Emily froze. The reflection's mouth opened wide, and for a moment she thought it was going to scream, but it didn't. It just silently mouthed something, its lips stretching and pulling in unnatural ways, as though trying to form a word. No, a warning. "Don't look," the reflection seemed to say, though no sound reached her ears. It was impossible, horrifying, but Emily saw it clear as day. She reached out, her hand trembling, but the reflection did not follow. It stayed behind the glass, motionless, its mouth still twisted into that silent scream. From that night on, things got worse. The pale figures grew bolder, closer. They no longer floated just through the walls, they pressed against them, their fingers scraping at the plaster, their mouths opening in silent, terrible pleas. Emily began to wonder if she was losing her mind. There were moments when the figures would come so close that she could almost reach out and touch them. Almost. The air around them was thick with a heavy, suffocating kind of grief. She could feel their eyes on her, feel the weight of their gazes pressing against her skin. Always that same knowing stare. Then one evening, while sitting at her kitchen table, Emily felt it again, that burning stare, the one that had never left her. She glanced down at the cracked egg, sitting on the counter, its blue surface now dull and chipped. Something about it seemed different now, as if the shell itself had somehow absorbed the weight of what had been happening to her. She reached out to touch it, her fingers trembling, and when she did, she saw it, a flash of movement behind the cracked shell, the eye. But it wasn't just one eye anymore. It was 100 eyes, all staring at her from the dark space inside the egg. Hundreds of tiny, unblinking eyes, all focused on her, all aware of her, waiting for something, waiting for her to break, to give in, to let them in. "Come back," they whispered, each one speaking in unison. "Come back." And Emily, now fully aware of the price of her curiosity, knew with sickening certainty that there was no way out. No escaping the eyes, the figures, the whispers. The egg had come to claim her. The next morning, Emily was gone. Her apartment remained empty, as though nothing had ever been there. The mirror, though, remained, and on the surface her reflection stood, silent, unmoving, its mouth frozen in that final scream. But now, if you look closely, you'll see something else. Eyes, dozens of eyes, watching you from within the glass, waiting for the next person to crack open their own egg, and the cycle will begin again. Story number 3. Every spring, when the first buds began to blossom and the chill of winter finally loosened its grip on the village, the hares would appear. They came in the early morning mist before the sun had a chance to warm the earth, creeping from the edges of the forest. There were always many of them, too many, in fact. Their fur was a dull, mottled brown, blending into the underbrush, and their eyes were dark, unblinking, like the quiet spaces between the trees. At first, the villagers paid little attention to the hares. They were just part of the season, harmless creatures, bounding across the fields, nibbling at the wild grasses that flourished near the edge of the woods. Children would chase them in the fields, laughing and calling to one another as the hares skittered just out of reach, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. But then, one by one, the children began to disappear. It started slowly. No one paid much attention when little Mary Ellis wandered off and didn't come home. Her parents thought she was playing by the stream again, lost in the world of make-believe that every child loved. But by nightfall, when she hadn't returned, panic set in. Her parents searched the woods, calling her name until their throats were raw, but there was no sign of her. The next day, they found only a small tuft of fur near the edge of the forest, matted with blood, and a broken piece of wicker from her basket. The village was shaken, but the real terror didn't sink in until the next spring when more children vanished. First little Tommy Grayson, then Lucy Davenport, and then finally young Henry Collins. Each time, the story was the same. The child had wandered too close to the woods, out where the trees grew thick and dark, and had simply disappeared. The air would grow heavy, the wind would still, and only the echoes of their laughter seemed to linger. The town was never the same after that. People stopped letting their children play near the woods. Mothers clutched their little ones tighter, and the streets seemed quieter somehow, as if the very air was holding its breath. But it wasn't enough. The hares kept coming, more numerous and bolder with each passing year, their dark eyes gleaming in the twilight. It was old Reverend Mason who finally spoke the truth, though it was a truth too terrible for many to accept. The town had always whispered about the debt, a debt as old as the woods themselves, a price that had to be paid each spring. The hares, they said, were not simply animals. They were the keepers of an ancient pact, one forged long ago between the villagers and something far darker than anyone cared to remember. The town's ancestors had settled here in the shadow of the forest, cutting down trees and building homes where there had once been only the wild, untamed land. And, as with all things, there had been a price. The elders had made a deal with the woods, with the old spirits that ruled over the land, to ensure the village's survival. But in exchange, the people had agreed to give something back, something precious. Every spring, when the hares came, a child would be taken. The hares would find them, lead them into the forest, and the spirits would claim their flesh. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew the price had to be paid. The prayers began, soon after the first child disappeared. The villagers prayed, desperate and fearful, but the woods were unmoved. The spirits didn't care for prayers, they only cared for the dead. And so it went on. Each spring the hares would come, and each spring another child would vanish. The town's population thinned over time, but the hares never stopped. They kept coming, year after year, silent and many, lurking at the forest's edge, their dark eyes watching. It wasn't until the spring of the 50th year that something truly terrible happened. A small group of villagers, men, women, the elderly, and the children who remained, decided to take a stand. Armed with nothing but their fear and the strength of desperation, they ventured into the woods, determined to break the cycle. They never came back. The village, now empty but for the older folk too frail to leave, grew quiet. The trees grew taller, the woods darker. The hares had stopped coming for the children, but their presence was still felt, deep in the roots of the land, in the creaking branches above, and in the silence that surrounded the village every time spring came around. And the town, so small and forgotten by time, was soon buried by the forest itself. But in the woods, the hares still lurk, silent and many, waiting. And every year, as the trees begin to bud, something or someone answers the call. Story number 4. The morning sun poured through the stained glass windows of St. John's Church, casting 1,000 fractured colors across the pews. It was Easter Sunday, and like every year, the church was packed with families, their clothes bright and fresh, their faces eager with the promise of the holiday. The children, excited, chattering, clutching their Easter baskets, rushed to their seats, their feet tapping against the stone floor in nervous anticipation. Today, like every year, the church would hold the pageant, the reenactment of Christ's resurrection. It was a tradition as old as the church itself, and every year, a boy from the town played the role of Jesus. This year, the part had been given to Noah Green, a shy, quiet boy with big brown eyes and a mop of dark hair that always seemed to fall in his face. Noah had been nervous about the role, but his mother had insisted. "It's a great honor," she told him, her voice both soft and stern, as if the weight of the tradition had been passed down from the generations before her. Noah stood at the front of the church now, dressed in a simple robe of white cloth, his face pale in the morning light. His role was simple: to lay in the tomb, still and lifeless until the moment of resurrection. When the time came, he would rise, eyes wide and alive, a symbol of rebirth, of hope, of the eternal promise that Easter represented. But today, something was different. The play began as it always did, with the priest leading the congregation through the familiar motions of the Easter story, the crucifixion, the burial, and then the resurrection. The children, playing the disciples, circled Noah's tomb, their faces filled with wonder and fear, just as they had for years. But when the moment came for Noah to rise from the tomb, something went wrong. Noah did not stir. At first, the director, Mrs. Halloway, assumed he was just nervous, that he was too shy to stand up in front of everyone. She motioned to him from the side of the stage, but Noah remained perfectly still, his eyes wide open, unblinking. His face, usually so expressive, was now a blank canvas, an empty mask. The children standing around him shifted awkwardly, unsure of what to do. The audience, quiet and expectant, waited. Mrs. Halloway stepped closer, whispering his name, her voice tight with anxiety. "Noah," she said, her hand on his shoulder, shaking him gently. It's time. Get up, Noah. You're supposed to get up now. But Noah did not respond. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Mrs. Holloway's hand trembled as she lifted his eyelids, expecting to see the familiar warmth of his brown eyes. Instead, they were wide, unblinking, empty, like two glass marbles, cold and lifeless. She jerked her hand back, startled by the chill of his skin, the stillness of his body. Panic rippled through the congregation, but no one knew what to do. The play had ground to a halt, the actors frozen in place, their faces pale with confusion. The priest moved to the front, his brow furrowed in concern. He knelt beside Noah, calling his name softly. But still, the boy didn't respond. The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, someone called for an ambulance. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. Noah was dead. The cause of death was never fully explained. The doctor said his heart had simply stopped. His body was cold, as though he had been dead for hours, but there had been no signs of illness, no previous warning. It was as if something had simply drained the life from him. That afternoon, the town was in shock. It was an Easter tragedy, an impossible, unimaginable event. But as the days passed, something even stranger began to unfold. At first, it was subtle. A man at the grocery store standing in line, staring blankly at the shelf of canned beans, his expression distant, unfeeling. Then, a woman at the post office, her gaze fixed ahead, unmoving, her lips parted as though she wanted to speak but could not. There were whispers among the townsfolk, people who knew Noah, people who had seen him that morning alive and full of life. They spoke in hushed tones about the strange things that had begun to happen. The town's children were the first to notice it. They whispered about it on their way to school, about the adults who had begun to act strange. They spoke of the silent, staring figures, people they had known their whole lives, now cold and still. And it wasn't just one person, it was many. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, adults and children alike, their eyes open wide, their expressions frozen, as if they were caught in some terrible moment they couldn't escape. At first, no one connected the two events, the death of Noah Green and the strange behavior of the townspeople. But soon, it became clear. Something had changed. A shadow had passed over the town, creeping into the hearts of those who had witnessed the tragedy, and now it was spreading. Each day, more and more people began to act like Noah. Silent, staring, cold. And then, one morning, there was a knock at the door of the Green household. It was Noah. But not Noah, not really. The boy standing on the porch looked just like him, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide and unblinking. But there was something wrong, something too still about him, too unnatural. "Mom?" he asked in a voice that was not his own, a voice too hollow, too empty. His mother, who had been mourning her son's death just days before, felt her heart seize with a terrible fear. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. "Noah?" she whispered, but the boy just stood there, silent, staring at her, his face expressionless. In the days that followed, more of the dead returned, pale, lifeless, staring as if they were waiting for something. People began to avoid them, turning away in fear, but it was no use. The dead, those who had been touched by whatever force had claimed Noah, moved among them, walking in their shadow, their eyes wide and blank. The town was changing, and the people, the living and the dead, knew that something old had returned. But it wasn't Christ. It wasn't resurrection. Not quite. Something else was here now. Something darker. And it was waiting. Story number 5. It was early on Easter morning when the cross first appeared. The sky was still gray with the remnants of dawn, and the village was quiet, wrapped in the stillness of the holiday. No one saw it happen. No one saw how it came to be. But by the time the sun had fully risen, it was there. A crooked, twisted wooden cross standing stark on the front lawn of the old Barton house. The house had been empty for years, abandoned after the last of the Bartons moved away, leaving only the creaking timbers and forgotten memories behind. The lawn had long since become overgrown, the flower beds untended, and the fence sagged with age. But now, there it was. The cross, its jagged edges and rough-hewn surface standing out like an intrusion, an oddity among the dying grass and brittle weeds. It wasn't the cross itself that caught people's attention. It was the way it looked. Bent at an impossible angle, as though someone had twisted it with their bare hands, the wood seemed to strain and groan against its own weight. The grain of the wood ran at strange angles like veins under skin, making the whole thing seem alive, as if the cross itself were in pain, pulling itself towards the earth, desperate to return to where it had come from. The air around it was thick, too, thick with the smell of earth, wet and rotting. A rancid smell that clung to the air, sinking into the lungs and making the throat tight. It was a smell that belonged to the ground, to decay, to the things that lived and died below the surface. People walking past the Barton house held their breath, avoiding the lawn as though it might swallow them whole. But it wasn't the cross that terrified them. It was the people who moved in soon after. The new owners of the Barton house were young, 2 of them, a couple. Sarah and Adam, their names were, moving from the city in search of something quieter, something simpler. They were eager, full of the kind of optimism that only comes with a fresh start, ready to turn the house into something new. The town didn't think much of them at first. It was a quiet place, after all, and new people came and went all the time. The townsfolk had grown used to strangers settling in, some staying for a while, others leaving just as quickly as they came. But there was something about Sarah and Adam that felt different. There was something too eager in their smiles, too desperate in their voices. At first, it wasn't noticeable. They painted the house, fixed up the garden, and started having parties in the evenings. Laughter spilled out from the open windows, their joy ringing through the quiet streets. But then, as the days passed, the laughter began to sound strange, hollow, as though it came from somewhere distant, like it didn't belong to them at all. It started with the shadows. At night, when Sarah and Adam stood at the windows, watching, the street, with strange, vacant expressions, their shadows on the walls would stretch unnaturally. Long and thin, they curled and twisted like they were trying to break free of the bodies they belonged to. It wasn't just the angle of the light, it was something else, something deeper, as though their very essence was bending under some invisible weight. And it was then that people started to notice it, the way they looked, the way they changed. Sarah's eyes became too wide, too bright. When she spoke, her voice had a strange metallic quality to it, as though she was speaking through a mouth that didn't belong to her. Adam, too, began to change. His face, which had once been warm, full of life, became colder, harder. His smile no longer reached his eyes. And it wasn't just the way they looked that unsettled the townsfolk, it was the way they acted. They no longer spoke with their neighbors, no longer greeted anyone who passed by. Their movements became erratic, as though they were being pulled by some invisible force, something just out of reach. Sometimes when they walked past each other in the house, their hands would brush, but their eyes would not meet. And always, there was the feeling that something else was there with them, something that walked just behind them, breathing with them, its presence heavy in the air. The children of the town were the first to speak of it. They were the ones who noticed the way Sarah and Adam stood by the window, staring at the cross in the yard, their faces drawn and pale. The children spoke of the figures they saw at night, standing just behind Sarah and Adam, faint and shadowy, watching with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. One night, when the wind howled through the trees and the moon hung full in the sky, the cross on the lawn shifted. It wasn't much, a small movement, just enough for the people who were still awake to notice. It seemed to pull itself from the earth, lifting just slightly as though it was being drawn up by unseen hands. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the house and the land itself were breathing together, their rhythm slow and deliberate. The following day, the cross was gone. No one saw it vanish. No one heard it. But when the sun rose and the townspeople made their way through the streets, they saw that the Barton house was different. The lawn was clean again, the grass neatly trimmed, the earth undisturbed. But where the cross had been, there was nothing. Only the faintest impression in the ground, as though something heavy had once stood there, leaving behind an imprint, a memory that was already fading. It was then that the true horror began to unfold. Sarah and Adam's laughter was gone. The windows of their house were dark, silent. No one had seen them leave. But as the days passed, more people began to feel it, the change. It wasn't just the house that had changed. It was everything. The town felt as though it had been pulled from its roots, as if something had been taken from it, something buried deep in the earth. And when people walked past the Barton house, they swore they could hear the sound of whispering, soft, like a breeze through the trees, but too steady to be natural. As for Sarah and Adam, they were never seen again. And the crooked cross, it remained deep in the earth, waiting for the next family, the next soul to come. Because some debts, once paid, are never truly gone. Story number 6. It was a Tuesday when Lily first received the tray. She had just returned home from work, the day dragging behind her, heavy with exhaustion. The soft spring light still hung in the air, slanting through the trees and casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Her house, the old yellow one on Orchard Lane, felt empty, silent in the way old homes sometimes do, as if the walls were holding their breath. It was the sort of house you could get lost in, a place where sounds from the outside world never seemed to reach. Lily had always liked it that way. She spotted the tray as soon as she stepped onto the porch. It was small, white, and lined with pastel-colored paper. At first glance, she thought it was just a package from the bakery down the street. But when she stepped closer, she saw that it was something else, something unexpected. A tray of marshmallow chicks, bright yellow and soft with little orange beaks, their tiny, sugary eyes staring up at her in a way that was almost too real. They were stacked neatly, 12 in all, each one a perfect, sugary replica of a baby chick. Lily's first instinct was to smile. It was the sort of quirky, odd gift you'd expect from someone who didn't know quite how to say hello. But there was no card, no note, no explanation. Just the tray of chicks, as if they'd appeared out of nowhere. Lily shrugged it off. She brought the tray inside, setting it on the kitchen counter. The soft scent of sugar and vanilla filled the air, but something about the way the marshmallow chicks sat there, perfectly arranged, unsettled her. The next morning, she woke up to find one of the chicks missing. At first, she thought it was her own doing. Maybe she had taken one without realizing it. Maybe in her sleep-deprived haze, she'd grabbed one and eaten it as a midnight snack. But when she checked the tray, she was certain of it. One was gone, and the remaining chicks were exactly as they had been the day before. She felt a prickle of unease slide down her spine, but she convinced herself that it was nothing. It was just a silly thing, nothing more. Each night, another chick disappeared. She began to keep track of it, marking the days on the calendar with little crosses. Every evening, she would stare at the tray before going to bed, but by morning, another chick would be gone. It wasn't much, just one at a time, but the pattern was undeniable. Each morning, the number dwindled until only a few were left. And, as the tray became emptier, Lily started to notice something else. The dreams began. At first, they were soft, like a whisper on the edge of sleep. Marshmallow chicks, yellow, soft, sticky, crawled across her chest, pressing down on her skin, their tiny bodies squirming as if they had a life of their own. They were smothering her, each one a weight, their softness turning heavy as they burrowed into the creases of her body, their little feet sticky with something that wasn't quite sugar. Her chest would rise and fall with every breath, but the weight of them never eased. She couldn't move, she couldn't cry out. It was as though the soft, squishy creatures had invaded her body, pressing down until she couldn't breathe. She woke each time with a start, gasping for air, her chest tight as if something heavy had been sitting on it. And each night the dreams grew worse. The yellow shapes grew larger, their soft bodies becoming suffocating. They pressed harder, against her, crawling over her, their eyes unblinking, watching her. She could feel the dampness of their bodies, the way they stuck to her skin, the way they suffocated her in the darkness. Lily didn't know what to do. She tried to avoid the tray, but it was always there, sitting on the kitchen counter, waiting. The remaining chicks stared at her with their small, bead-like eyes, their soft bodies gleaming in the dim light. Then, one evening, after she had finished a long shift at work, she came home to find the tray empty. Not a single chick was left, just the empty space where the marshmallow bodies had once been. Her heart skipped a beat, a ripple of dread unfurling in her stomach. It was as if the last chick had disappeared, leaving behind something darker, something that wasn't quite right. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, that the dreams were just the result of stress or lack of sleep. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard something, a faint scratching at her window. At first, it was nothing, just the wind. But then the scratching grew louder, more insistent, as though something small and desperate was trying to get inside. She got up to check, her heart pounding in her chest, and when she peered out of the window she saw nothing but the darkened street. But that's when she saw it, the faintest movement on the edge of her vision, a shadow darting past the porch light, something small and quick. The next morning, she saw the neighbors standing on their porch, whispering among themselves. The woman from 2 houses down, Mrs. Langford, caught Lily's eye and gave a quick, sharp nod. "You know," Mrs. Langford said quietly, "the last tenant here, she left suddenly. One night, just up and vanished, like she'd never been here at all. Strange, isn't it?" Lily didn't respond, but the chill that ran down her spine was enough to freeze her. She knew exactly what Mrs. Langford meant. The last tenant, the woman who had lived in her house before her, had left just as quickly and quietly as the marshmallow chicks had disappeared, as if something had pulled her away. That night, the scratching came again, but this time Lily didn't get up. Instead, she lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. waiting. And in the silence, she felt it. The soft, sticky pressure against her chest. The yellow shapes crawling, pressing down. The marshmallow chicks had come to claim her, just as they had claimed the last woman. And she realized too late that they hadn't been meant for eating. They had come to consume her. Story number 7. It had always been a tradition at the Morris estate, a custom passed down from one generation to the next. Every Easter, the grand estate opened its gates to the village, hosting a grand egg hunt for the children. The sprawling grounds, covered in wildflowers and tangled hedgerows, were the perfect backdrop for the event. The children, baskets in hand, would scurry through the grounds, racing to collect the colorful eggs hidden in the grass, nestled in the crooks of trees, or tucked inside hollowed-out rocks. This year, however, there was something different about the hunt. The estate itself seemed more distant than usual, as though the old house and its surrounding land had grown colder overnight. The usual cheer in the air was absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness, like the earth itself had become hesitant, unsure of the day's festivities. It was the first year the Morris family had allowed the hunt to continue after old Mr. Morris passed away. His death had left a quiet void, and though his children, Henry and Claire, had tried to keep things running smoothly, the absence of the patriarch was palpable. At first, no one thought much of it. The children ran across the estate with their shrill laughter filling the air, their voices bouncing off the old stone walls of the house. But something strange was happening as the children returned with their baskets, each one holding brightly colored eggs. The parents smiled weakly, accepting the prizes their children had brought, but something in their eyes seemed off. Henry Morris, the youngest of the family, hadn't even bothered to organize the hunt properly. It had been a last-minute decision, and he seemed distracted, his face drawn with a pale, sickly hue. Claire, the older sister, had stood silently by the door of the manor, watching the children's excited faces without saying a word. Her hands were clasped tightly and her fingers trembled. As the children brought their eggs back, they seemed eager, but also strangely unsettled. There was something about the eggs that wasn't right. At first, it was just a faint smell, something sour and rank that lingered around the baskets. The parents tried to ignore it, but it grew worse as the afternoon wore on. The eggs themselves were unusual in a way no one could quite pinpoint. They had an unnatural sheen, almost as though the colors on their surfaces were too perfect, too smooth. But when the children cracked open their prizes, the horror truly began. Inside each egg was something different, something repulsive. Teeth, sharp and jagged, glistened in the light. Clumps of matted hair, black, brown, and wiry, tangled with something slick, something that squirmed and wiggled in the hollow space. The texture was wrong, like wet skin, and each child recoiled in disgust, their faces paling. But it wasn't just the children who noticed something was wrong. Their parents, too, began to act strange. At first, it was subtle, a thickening of the voice like something sticky in the throat. Then their eyes began to change. Claire had been the first to notice it, watching her father's gaze as he handed his son a basket of eggs. His eyes had turned yellow, the whites of his eyes fading, and his pupils shifting like something beneath the surface was stirring. "Dad?" she asked softly, but he didn't answer. He only stared at her, his smile thin and unnatural. Henry's voice, too, had changed. It had become slow, thick, as though something was growing inside of him, something that needed to be said but couldn't quite make it out. "Don't worry, Claire," he said one evening, his words slurring. "The eggs they're fine. everything's fine. But everything was not fine. The changes didn't stop with their voices. As the days passed, it was as though the family members were growing, taller, broader, but in a way that was disturbing. The air around them seemed to hum with a quiet, unnerving energy, like something was waiting to emerge, something that was not entirely human. Claire watched in horror as her father's skin began to stretch, his face becoming taut, as though the flesh itself was tight against something inside. His movements became jerky, as though the old familiar bones of his body had been replaced with something new, something unfamiliar, and the yellow in his eyes deepened until they became nearly all-encompassing, leaving little trace of the man who had once been there. The neighbors began to notice too. The subtle changes were enough to make them uneasy, enough to make them step back and say nothing, whispering behind closed doors. It was not just the family members. There was something in the air around the estate, something that seemed to press in on the land, suffocating it with a sense of dread. The flowers in the garden stopped blooming. The trees seemed to sway unnaturally, as if they were listening, waiting, and the children who had once been so joyful, began to change as well. Their eyes grew wider, darker, and when they laughed, their voices no longer held the sweetness of innocence. They would often be found standing in the corners of rooms, staring at their parents with empty, unwavering eyes, their hands twitching, as though they had been touched by something far older, far darker. Claire had tried to talk to Henry, but he no longer seemed like the brother she had known. His eyes were now completely yellow, his skin slick with something other than sweat. His fingers, long and brittle, twitched constantly. "Don't worry," he said again, in that same thick voice. "They're just growing. Everything's hatching." But Claire knew it was something far worse than growth. Something inside them was changing. Something not human. Something that had come from deep within the earth, from the land that had been cursed long before the first Morris had set foot on it. The Easter eggs, filled with teeth, hair, and something that writhed, had been the signal. The hatching had begun. The instincts, once dormant, were clawing their way out, and nothing would stop it now. Claire knew with a bone-deep certainty that whatever had begun in the eggs had only just started to show itself, and it would not be long before it would take them all. Story number 8. Every Easter, the same ritual played out in the Dorley household. The house, tucked away at the edge of the village, would come alive with the clatter of plates, the scent of roast lamb, and the laughter of family. It was a tradition, one that stretched back as long as anyone could remember, to gather together around the dinner table and share the meal. But there was always something different about Easter at the Dorleys, something that no one ever spoke of. Each year, after the meal was served, after the last of the dessert had been consumed, and the soft hum of conversation filled the room, there was a moment when the door would open, and there, standing just inside, would be the guest. No one ever knew who he was or how he came to be there. He was always the same, tall, thin, with a wide, unsettling smile that never quite reached his eyes. His clothes were old-fashioned too, neat, too pressed, as if he had stepped out of another time altogether. His hands, long and slender, were always folded neatly in front of him, but he never ate. He never drank. He simply sat at the table, nodding in time with the conversation, his eyes fixed on the family as if they were the only thing in the world. "Who invited you?" Evelyn Dorley, the matriarch, would ask, a smile curving her lips as though it were a joke. But it wasn't really a joke. No one ever invited him, but every year, without fail, he was there. The children would laugh nervously, and the adults would look at one another in a way that was too practiced, as if they were all aware of something unspoken but were too polite to address it. The guest always arrived after dinner, just as the conversation had begun to slow, when the family was settling into that comfortable, warm space after a large meal. He would settle into the seat at the end of the table, and they would continue, as if nothing were out of the ordinary, though the unease in the room would grow with every passing moment. And then, without fail, after the pie was served and the plates were cleared, the youngest Dorley child would slip away. It wasn't always the same child. It was as though the guest chose a different one each year, though no one could say why. Sometimes the child would leave quietly, slipping out of the room unnoticed. Other times there would be a moment of hesitation, a strange look in their eyes, as if they knew something no one else did. But after they left, they were never quite the same. Sometimes they would return after an hour, sometimes two, their eyes wide and distant, as if they had been somewhere else, somewhere far away. Other times they would not return at all. The family would search the house, calling out their names in vain, but the child would be gone. The house would feel empty, as though something essential had been taken away, and the Dorleys would sit together in silence, wondering how much they had truly lost. The guest, however, would always leave with a smile. He would stand, straightening his clothes, and walk to the door, nodding politely to each of them as though he were bidding them farewell. And then, just before he stepped out, he would whistle. The song was always the same, a quiet, eerie melody that no one could quite place, a tune that seemed to echo in their minds long after he had gone. The whistling would fade as he disappeared into the night, but the air would always feel heavier. Afterward, as though the room itself had taken a deep, painful breath. The next morning, when the Dorleys woke, everything would seem normal. The sun would shine through the windows and the house would smell of spring, fresh and clean, as though nothing had happened at all. But the missing child would be forgotten, buried beneath the polite silence of the family. No one would speak of it. No one would question the empty seat at the table or the lingering chill in the air where the guest had sat. But it was always there. The unease, the sense that something was wrong, something unspoken that hovered between the family like a shadow. Years passed, and the tradition continued. The guest arrived at the same time every Easter, his smile never faltering, his whistling always the same. The Dorleys began to grow older, and the children, one by one, began to leave. But no matter how many years went by, the guest still came. No one ever remembered inviting him, and no one ever remembered asking for him to stay. But every Easter, without fail, he would be there, waiting, watching. And the youngest, Dorley, would always slip away, sometimes for hours, sometimes forever. No one ever spoke of it, and no one ever asked why. Story number 9. It was a quiet Easter Sunday when Emma brought the lamb home. The church had always held a petting zoo in the old barn behind the sanctuary. The children would gather there after the service, eager to pet the goats, rabbits, and chickens, their faces lit with excitement and the promise of spring. This year, though, something was different. There was a newborn lamb, barely a week old, its wool soft and white, its legs shaky as it trotted around the pen. Emma, shy and soft-spoken, was immediately drawn to it. She didn't ask for it. It simply seemed to find her. The lamb nuzzled against her, its tiny nose sniffing her outstretched hand, and Emma, who had never been one for asking for things, felt an unexpected pull in her chest. She knew, deep down, that she had to take it. "Mom, can I bring it home?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Her mother, distracted by the other children and the day's festivities, barely glanced at her. "Of course, sweetie, it's Easter, right? We'll make room for it." The lamb seemed to sense the invitation. The moment Emma stood, the animal followed her, its tiny hooves clicking softly against the barn's wooden floor. It looked up at her, its big, brown eyes so full of something, trust or maybe need, that Emma could not refuse. When they left the church that afternoon, Emma carried the lamb in her arms, its body warm against her chest as the afternoon sun began to dip. She felt a strange connection to it, an unspoken understanding. But something in the air had changed. Something in the soft spring breeze that tickled her hair and brushed against her skin. A heaviness had settled over her, something thick and unnatural. That night, as Emma settled into bed with the lamb beside her, she didn't think much of the strange flicker in its eyes. The lamb had seemed calm at first, content to rest beside her. But as the night deepened, its eyes began to glow faintly in the dark, a sickly red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Emma watched, wide-eyed, as the lamb's gaze shifted toward her with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She turned away, pulling the covers tight around her, but the whispering started then. Low at first, a soft murmur she couldn't quite understand. It wasn't in any language she knew. It was more like the sound of wind rustling through dry leaves, or the murmur of voices just out of reach. The words were strange and sharp, slipping into her dreams as though they had always been there. "Emma, Emma." She woke with a start, the words still echoing in her mind. The room was still dark, the only sound the soft bleating of the lamb at the foot of her bed. But its eyes, those eyes, were wide and unblinking, the red light flickering like distant flames. The next day, she noticed something else. The lamb had grown. Its legs had lengthened, its body broader, its wool no longer soft and fluffy but coarse and matted. It had changed, and so quickly Emma felt a strange unease creeping into her chest. But she didn't tell anyone. Her mother was too busy, and her father had always been indifferent to the animals that came and went in their lives. Each night, the lamb grew faster. Each night, its eyes flickered with that same unnatural red glow. Emma's sleep became restless, the whispers louder, more insistent, repeating the same strange, guttural sounds she couldn't decipher. She tried to ignore it, tried to sleep, but the sensation of something wrong, something foreign, pressing against her thoughts kept her awake. Soon, it wasn't just the lamb that changed. One morning, Emma found it in the kitchen. The lamb had grown even larger, its body now filling the small space it occupied. It looked at her as she entered, and for the first time, she saw the hunger in its eyes. Not the innocent curiosity of a child's pet, but something darker, something older. It stood there, its hooves clicking on the wooden floor, its red eyes watching her with a kind of knowing. It wasn't the lamb anymore. The whispers were louder now, calling to her, filling her thoughts with a language she should not know. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was speaking to her, not as a pet, but as something far more ancient, far more dangerous. The words, those strange, guttural syllables, rattled in her mind, and she felt as though they were wrapping themselves around her thoughts, tightening with every passing hour. That night, Emma woke to the sound of footsteps. Not the soft padding of hooves, but something heavier, larger. She opened her eyes and saw the lamb standing by the door, but it wasn't a lamb anymore. Its eyes were fully red now, glowing in the dark, its body swollen and misshapen. the wool now thick and matted like dark fur. And its mouth was open, wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Emma, come closer, little one." The voice wasn't hers anymore. It was rough, hoarse, and deep, like it had come from somewhere deep in the earth. It didn't sound like the lamb. It didn't sound like anything human. Emma didn't scream. She didn't know how to scream. Instead, she stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest as the creature, whatever it was now, slowly stepped closer, its eyes never leaving hers. And then she saw it. The thing that wasn't the lamb. The thing that had taken its place. It was smiling. But its smile wasn't the innocent, soft thing it had been before. This smile was wide, twisted, full of something that should not have been in that small, innocent body. It leaned forward, its teeth gleaming, and whispered once, "More. It's time, Emma. Time to come home." Emma didn't move. That was the last time anyone saw her. Her parents searched the house for hours, calling her name, knocking on doors, asking neighbors. They found nothing. The lamb, though, was gone. There was no sign of it, no trace of its red eyes or its unnatural growth. The police came, asking questions no one could answer. But deep down, they all knew. Because by the time Emma's parents returned home that night, the whispers had already started again. Louder this time. The language was there again, slipping into their minds, the words wrapping themselves around their thoughts, sinking deeper and deeper. And as they listened, they felt something stir, something old, something that had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to hatch. Story number 10. It began on the first day of spring, just as the crocuses were starting to bloom and the last traces of winter's grip were loosening. The children of Mill Hollow, small town nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, were excited. It was Easter weekend, and like every year, there was the usual mix of egg hunts, candy, and the promise of something sweet. But this year, something was different. It started when Sarah and Ben found the first egg. It was tucked beneath an old oak tree, far from the usual path where the town had hidden its candy for the annual hunt. It wasn't one of the usual brightly colored plastic eggs. No, this one was different. It was a chocolate egg, but the surface had a strange sheen to it, almost too smooth, too perfect. There were no cracks, no imperfections. It looked almost new, unnaturally so. Sarah was the first to pick it up. "Hey, look at this," she called, her voice tinged with excitement and a little curiosity. Ben, always the more cautious of the two, looked at it warily. "Is that one supposed to be here?" he asked, a knot of unease twisting in his stomach. Sarah shrugged. "Doesn't matter. I found it, so it's mine." They sat down under the tree, their backs against the rough bark, and broke the egg open. Inside, it wasn't filled with the usual candy or even a prize. Instead, there was a piece of paper, old and brittle, like it had been hidden for years. Sarah unrolled it with trembling fingers, and Ben watched, his unease growing. The paper held only a few words, written in jagged, uneven handwriting. The location of Charlie. "He's under the old mill." The moment Sarah read the words aloud, a heavy silence fell over them. The air seemed to thicken, the rustling of the trees growing distant as if they were in a bubble, cut off from the world. The unsettling feeling in Ben's stomach intensified. "Charlie, but he's been missing for months," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think—" "I don't know," Sarah interrupted, the shock still echoing in her voice. "But we have to tell someone. We have to—" Before she could finish, a loud crack split the air, a sound so sharp, so sudden that they both jumped. The egg had split open completely, revealing more than just the paper. Inside, hidden in the hollow shell, was something else. Something soft, something wet. A small, writhing thing, like a handful of wriggling worms. Sarah screamed and dropped the egg, pushing herself away from it. Ben froze, his stomach turning. Neither of them knew what to do, but instinct told them to run, to get away from the egg, from whatever had just been revealed. The rest of the day passed in a haze. The words on the paper wouldn't leave Sarah's mind, and Ben could feel a growing unease that he couldn't shake. That night, they both lay awake in their rooms, staring at the ceiling, unable to forget what they had seen. It wasn't just the strange egg. It wasn't just the words. It was something else, something that had felt wrong from the very beginning. The next day, the children of Mill Hollow found more eggs, just like the first one. Hollow chocolate eggs, smooth and perfect, hidden in odd places in spots where they'd never been before. And when they cracked them open, they found secrets. Little pieces of information that didn't belong in the world of Easter egg hunts. Lily found an egg beneath the porch of her grandmother's house. Inside it, there was a note, scribbled quickly. He heard them fighting. They didn't know you were listening. She couldn't make sense of the words, but something inside her twisted, a feeling of dread unfurling in her chest. She'd never known what her parents had fought about, but now, the knowledge clung to her, tight and suffocating. Dylan found an egg in the bushes at the edge of the park. Inside, it told him, "The body is under the tulips. They've been waiting for you to come back." He didn't understand it, but he didn't need to. The words hung in his mind like a dark promise. He felt sick, as if something was crawling under his skin, something he couldn't see, but could feel. One by one, the children of Mill Hollow ate the eggs, each one revealing secrets too terrible to know. And each time, as they consumed the knowledge, something inside them started to slip away. At first, it was small, forgotten names, faces that didn't belong, pieces of memories that unraveled like threads. But as the days went on, it became more pronounced. They would forget things, simple things, what day it was, the sound of their parents' voices, even the names of people they had known for years. But it wasn't just the children who changed. The adults of Mill Hollow began to notice something was wrong, too. The whispers at the dinner table grew louder. The tension in the air was palpable. They spoke less, laughed less, and when they looked at their children, they saw something that wasn't quite there, something hollow in their eyes. One evening, Sarah found herself standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. She could feel it, the emptiness. Inside her, the growing hole where something important had once been. She couldn't remember what it was. She couldn't remember anything about herself anymore. The whispers, louder now, always there in the background, told her things she didn't want to know, things she couldn't forget. She reached for the eggs, each one sitting on the kitchen counter, waiting to be opened, waiting to give her more of what she didn't want. But she couldn't stop herself. She cracked another egg open. The message inside was simple, but it froze her blood. You've lost yourself. It's too late to stop now. The town of Mill Hollow never spoke of the eggs again. The children, their faces pale and blank, walked through the streets as if they were not quite alive, and the secrets they had uncovered, secrets meant to stay buried, now filled their minds, taking root, filling them with knowledge they could never undo. And as the last pieces of themselves faded away, the hollow eggs sat, waiting, because some secrets, once uncovered, take everything in exchange. Are you ready to uncover the terrifying truth behind the hollow eggs? Watch now to learn what happens when knowledge comes at a deadly cost, and share your thoughts. What would you do if the secrets you uncovered began to steal your memories? Subscribe, like, and hit the bell for more spine-chilling Easter horror stories.